In 1789, a mob of starving Parisians stormed the Bastille and kicked off one of the bloodiest revolutions in history. Historians point to bread shortages, class resentment, and Enlightenment philosophy. But there is one cause that rarely makes the textbook: salt. Specifically, a crushing tax on salt called the gabelle that had been bleeding the French poor dry for over 400 years. Wars have been waged over it. Entire economies have been built on it. The Roman Empire paid its soldiers with it. The word salary literally comes from the Latin word for salt, and at one point in medieval Africa, salt was traded ounce for ounce with gold. But today, you can buy a container of it for about $1 at any grocery store, and most people never think twice about it. So how did this simple white mineral go from being the most valuable substance on Earth to something we casually toss on French fries? To understand salt, you have to start with biology. The human body contains about 250 grams of sodium chloride at any given time. That is roughly enough to fill a small shaker. Your muscles need it to contract. Your nerves need it to fire electrical signals. Your cells need it to maintain the right balance of water. Without salt, your body shuts down. Your blood pressure drops, your brain swells, and eventually your organs fail. This is not a slow process either. Severe sodium depletion can kill a person in days. Early humans figured this out long before they had any understanding of chemistry. They watched animals. Deer, elephants, and mountain goats would travel enormous distances to reach natural salt deposits, sometimes hundreds of miles across dangerous terrain. These were called salt licks, exposed patches of mineral-rich earth where sodium chloride seeped to the surface. African elephants have been observed walking through pitch-dark cave systems, feeling their way along the walls with their trunks, just to reach underground salt deposits. They scrape the mineral off the rock walls with their tusks. Humans watched this behavior and followed the trails. Prehistoric hunters tracked animal paths to salt licks and eventually started harvesting salt for themselves. Some of the earliest evidence of deliberate salt production comes from a site in what is now Romania, where archaeologists found salt springs that were being exploited as far back as 6,000 years before the Common Era. That makes organized salt production older than the Egyptian pyramids by a wide margin. In the Yuncheng Salt Lake region of China, evidence suggests that humans were collecting salt from evaporated lake beds even earlier, possibly as far back as 8,000 years ago. These were not casual activities. Communities settled permanently around salt sources, and some of the earliest known trade networks appear to have been organized specifically to move salt from places that had it to places that did not. But collecting salt from a spring or a dried lake bed is one thing. Turning it into a commodity that could be stored, transported, and traded across hundreds of miles, that required something else entirely. It required technology, organization, and eventually, government control. And this is where salt starts reshaping civilization. The ancient Egyptians were among the first to realize that salt could preserve things. They used a naturally occurring compound called natron, which is mostly sodium carbonate and sodium bicarbonate, to dry out the bodies of their dead. This was the foundation of mummification. The process took about 70 days. Workers would remove the internal organs, pack the body cavity with natron, and then cover the entire corpse in the mineral. Over the following weeks, the natron absorbed all the moisture from the tissues, leaving behind a dried, preserved body that could last for thousands of years. Without salt, there are no mummies. Without mummies, the entire Egyptian afterlife religion looks completely different. The preservation of the body was not optional in Egyptian belief. It was essential for the soul to survive in the next world. But preservation went far beyond funeral rituals. Salt could keep fish and meat edible for months, sometimes years. In a world without refrigeration, this was not a luxury. It was the difference between surviving a winter and starving to death. Egyptian fishermen along the Nile would gut their catch, pack it in salt, and store it in clay jars that could be transported up and down the river. The Romans later perfected a fermented fish sauce called garum, made by layering fish and salt in large stone vats and letting the mixture break down in the sun for weeks. Garum was so popular across the Roman world that factories producing it could be found from Spain to the coast of North Africa. It was essentially the ketchup of the ancient Mediterranean, and it was only possible because of salt. Cultures that controlled salt could stockpile food, feed armies on the march, and trade preserved goods over vast distances. Cultures without salt were at a massive disadvantage. Halfway around the world, the Chinese had figured this out independently. Archaeological evidence from the Sichuan province suggests that Chinese communities were drilling for salt brine as early as 3,000 years before the Common Era. They would sink bamboo pipes deep into the earth, pump up the salty water, and boil it in iron pans to extract the crystals. This technology was remarkably advanced for its time. Some of these boreholes reached depths of over 300 feet. And here is the part that does not get enough credit. The Chinese accidentally discovered natural gas while drilling for salt brine. They found that flammable gas would sometimes escape from the boreholes, and rather than running away, they figured out how to pipe it through more bamboo tubes and use it as fuel to heat the evaporation pans. So, in a very real sense, salt drilling in ancient China led to one of the earliest known uses of natural gas as an energy source. The Chinese did not just harvest salt, they industrialized it. And in the process, they stumbled onto technologies that would not become widespread in the Western world for another 2,000 years. The government noticed, by the time of the Han Dynasty, around 200 years before the Common Era, the Chinese imperial government had established a state monopoly on salt. Private production was banned. The penalty for illegal salt trading was death. This was not about seasoning food. Salt revenue funded the military, built infrastructure, and kept the empire running. A government minister named Sang Hongyang argued that salt and iron monopolies were essential to state power because they allowed the government to extract revenue without directly taxing farmers, which tended to cause unrest. For the next 2,000 years, salt monopolies would remain one of the single largest sources of government income in China. Emperors rose and fell, dynasties changed names, but the salt tax endured through all of it. Now, the Chinese were not the only ones who understood the strategic value of salt. Over in the Mediterranean, the Romans built one of their most important roads specifically to transport it. The Via Salaria, literally meaning the salt road, ran from Rome northeast to the Adriatic coast, where sea salt was harvested through solar evaporation. Roman soldiers stationed across the expanding empire needed salt to preserve their rations. And, according to the ancient historian Pliny the Elder, soldiers were sometimes paid directly in salt or given an allowance specifically to buy it. The Latin word for this allowance was salarium. You can hear it. Salary. Every time you get a paycheck, you are participating in a linguistic tradition that stretches back over 2,000 years to a Roman soldier buying salt with his wages. But the Romans did more than just transport salt, they weaponized it. There is a famous legend that after Rome finally defeated Carthage in 146, before the Common Era, the victorious Roman general ordered the fields of Carthage sown with salt so that nothing would ever grow there again. Now, historians debate whether this actually happened, because salting that much farmland would have required an absurd quantity of a very expensive resource. But the fact that the story exists at all tells you something about how people in the ancient world understood salt. It was valuable enough to be currency, and destructive enough to be a weapon. While Rome was building roads to move salt westward, another trade network was forming across one of the harshest landscapes on Earth, the Sahara Desert. Starting around the 8th century, enormous camel caravans began crossing the desert, carrying slabs of rock salt harvested from mines in places like Tagaza, a settlement so remote and inhospitable that even its buildings were constructed from blocks of salt. The miners at Tagaza were mostly enslaved people who lived and worked in conditions that are difficult to imagine. Temperatures regularly exceeded 120 degrees. There was no fresh water for miles. Food had to be brought in from outside. The Arab traveler Ibn Battuta visited Tagaza in the 1300s and described it as one of the most miserable places on Earth. But the salt that came out of those mines was worth a fortune. These caravans would travel south for weeks, sometimes months, heading toward the trading cities of West Africa, places like Timbuktu and Jen. A single caravan could include thousands of camels, each one carrying 2 large slabs of rock salt weighing around 200 pounds. The journey was brutal. Sandstorms could bury entire groups. Dehydration killed both camels and men. Bandits lurked along the routes. But the potential profits were so enormous that merchants kept coming back, year after year, generation after generation. And when they arrived in the markets of West Africa, something remarkable happened. Salt was exchanged for gold. Not metaphorically, literally, ounce for ounce, pound for pound. In parts of West Africa, where gold was relatively abundant, but salt was desperately scarce, a slab of rock salt could buy its weight in gold dust. Some accounts describe a system of silent barter, where the salt traders and gold traders would leave their goods in designated spots without ever meeting face to face, each side adding to their offer until both parties were satisfied. Think about that for a moment. The substance sitting in your kitchen cabinet right now was once considered equal in value to the most universally treasured metal in human history. These trans-Saharan trade routes did not just move commodities, they built empires. The Mali Empire, which dominated West Africa during the 1300s and 1400s, owed much of its staggering wealth to controlling the southern end of the salt and gold trade. Mansa Musa, the Emperor of Mali, became so rich from this trade that when he made a pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324, he reportedly spent so much gold in Cairo that he crashed the Egyptian gold market for over a decade. And salt was at the foundation of all of it. Back in Europe, a very different kind of salt empire was taking shape. The city of Venice, perched on its lagoons in the northern Adriatic, had been producing sea salt since at least the 7th century. But the Venetians were not content with just making salt. They wanted to control who could buy and sell it across the entire Mediterranean. By the 1200s, Venice had established a near monopoly on the salt trade in the region. They would buy salt cheaply from producers along the coast, stockpile it in massive warehouses, and then sell it at enormous markups to cities and kingdoms that depended on it. Any competitor who tried to undercut Venetian prices was met with economic pressure or, when that failed, military force. Venice actually went to war over salt. In 1307, the Republic fought the War of Chioggia against Genoa, and control of salt production in the Adriatic was one of the central issues. Venice won. And with that victory, they tightened their grip on the Mediterranean salt trade even further. Salt funded the Venetian navy. The Venetian navy protected the salt trade. It was a self-reinforcing cycle that turned a city of wooden stilts and mudflats into one of the wealthiest and most influential powers in the medieval world. At its peak, Venice controlled salt distribution from the eastern Mediterranean to the coasts of North Africa, and the profits from that trade helped finance the stunning architecture, art, and culture that we still associate with the city today. Further north, in the Austrian Alps, the story of salt and power played out in a different way. The city of Salzburg, whose name literally translates to Salt Fortress, grew rich from the enormous salt mines in the surrounding mountains. These mines had been active since at least the Bronze Age. In fact, archaeologists have found the preserved body of an ancient salt miner in the Hallstatt mine, complete with his leather backpack and tools, dating back roughly 3,000 years. The dry, salty environment kept his remains intact for millennia, much like the Egyptian mummies preserved by Natron. By the medieval period, these alpine mines were generating massive revenue for the local archbishops who controlled them. The wealth was staggering. Salt money built the ornate Baroque palaces and churches of Salzburg that tourists still visit today. It paid for the armies that defended Habsburg territory, and it gave the region a level of prosperity that persisted for centuries. The Habsburgs, the dynasty that would eventually rule most of Central Europe, drew significant income from these same alpine salt deposits. The connection between salt and political authority was so deeply embedded that you could literally read it in the name of the city itself. But wherever there was salt wealth, there was also conflict. In 1597, the Spanish rulers of Naples tried to impose a new tax on salt. The response was immediate and violent. The Neapolitan people, already struggling under heavy taxation, erupted in revolt. They attacked tax collectors, burned government buildings, and briefly seized control of parts of the city. The Spanish eventually crushed the rebellion, but the Salt War of Naples became a lasting symbol of what happens when you squeeze people too hard on something they literally cannot live without. The French learned this lesson on a much larger and more catastrophic scale. The gabelle, France's infamous salt tax, had been around in various forms since the 1300s. By the 17th and 18th centuries, it had become one of the most hated institutions in the country. The tax was not applied evenly. Some provinces paid enormous rates, while others were partially exempt, creating a thriving black market in smuggled salt. The government responded with an army of salt police, the gabellers, who raided homes, searched travelers, and arrested anyone caught with untaxed salt. Punishments ranged from heavy fines to years of forced labor in the royal galleys. At its peak, an estimated 3,000 people per year were imprisoned or sentenced for salt smuggling in France. The gabelle did not cause the French Revolution on its own, but it was one of the clearest, most personal examples of aristocratic greed that ordinary French citizens experienced in their daily lives. When the revolutionaries drew up their list of grievances, the salt tax was near the top. Across the Atlantic, salt would play a surprising role in the American Civil War. The Confederate States, cut off from northern industry and foreign imports by the Union naval blockade, faced a desperate salt shortage by 1862. Salt was essential for preserving meat to feed the Confederate Army. Without it, rations spoiled, soldiers weakened, and morale collapsed. The price of salt in the South skyrocketed. Before the war, a bag of salt cost about $2. By 1862, that same bag was selling for $60 in some parts of the Confederacy. Families that had never worried about salt suddenly could not afford it. The Union knew exactly how critical this shortage was and deliberately targeted Confederate salt works. In 1862, Union forces destroyed the massive salt production facility at Saltville, Virginia, one of the South's most important sources. Other raids hit salt works along the Gulf Coast in Florida and Louisiana. The Confederacy scrambled to dig new wells, scrape salt from smokehouse floors, and even boil dirt from the ground beneath old meatpacking plants to extract whatever sodium remained in the soil. Women would tear up the floorboards of their smokehouses and leach the salt-saturated earth through makeshift filters. It was never enough. Some historians argue that the salt shortage contributed as much to the Confederate defeat as any battlefield loss. Wars are won by logistics, and salt was at the heart of Civil War logistics in a way that most people never learn about. But perhaps the most dramatic and consequential salt story in modern history took place in India in 1930. For decades, the British colonial government had maintained a monopoly on salt production in India. Indians were legally prohibited from making or collecting their own salt, even though it washed up freely on the beaches of their own coastline. They were forced to buy government salt at prices inflated by heavy taxation. For most Indians, especially the rural poor, this was both a financial burden and a daily humiliation. Mohandas Gandhi understood this. He understood that salt was not just a commodity, but a symbol. Everyone needed it. Everyone was affected by the tax. And the injustice of being forbidden from picking up a natural mineral from your own shore was so obvious that it required no explanation. On March 12, 1930, Gandhi set out on foot from his ashram near Ahmedabad with 78 followers. Their destination was the coastal village of Dandi, 240 miles away on the shores of the Arabian Sea. They walked for 24 days. By the time they arrived on April 6th, thousands of people had joined the march, and the entire world was watching. Gandhi walked to the edge of the water, reached down, and picked up a small lump of natural salt from the mud. It was a simple act, almost absurdly simple, but it was also an act of deliberate defiance against the entire structure of British colonial authority. Within weeks, millions of Indians were making their own salt, buying illegal salt and openly breaking the law in solidarity. The British responded with mass arrests. Over 60,000 people were jailed, including Gandhi himself. But the damage was done. The Salt March did not end British rule in India overnight, but it shattered the moral authority of the empire in a way that could never be repaired, all because of salt. And then, almost anticlimactically, salt stopped being scarce. The Industrial Revolution changed everything. Mechanical mining equipment could extract rock salt from deep underground deposits at a speed and scale that would have been unimaginable a century earlier. In Cheshire, England, industrial salt mines opened up that could produce more salt in a single week than an entire medieval saltworks could produce in a year. Vacuum evaporation technology allowed producers to refine salt with unprecedented efficiency, removing impurities and creating the uniform white crystals we recognize today. New transportation networks, railways, steamships, highways, made it possible to move millions of tons of salt across continents for almost nothing. The discovery of enormous underground salt deposits also changed the equation. The Wieliczka salt mine in Poland, which had been operating since the 13th century, was expanded dramatically with industrial equipment. In the United States, vast salt deposits were found beneath the Great Lakes region, in Kansas, in Louisiana, and in Texas. These deposits were so large that they could supply the entire world for centuries. By the 20th century, salt had gone from one of the most strategic resources on Earth to one of the cheapest. The same mineral that funded the Roman military, built the Venetian Navy, and triggered the French Revolution was now being dumped on icy roads in Minnesota winters and sold in bulk at warehouse stores. Today, the world produces roughly 300 million tons of salt every year. The majority of it is used for industrial purposes, things like chemical manufacturing, water treatment, and yes, de-icing roads. Only a small fraction ends up on your dinner table. A 26-ounce container of table salt costs somewhere around $1 in most American grocery stores. Adjusted for inflation, salt is cheaper now than at any point in recorded human history. And there is something both wonderful and strange about that. For thousands of years, salt shaped the fate of nations. It determined which cities prospered and which ones starved. It decided which armies could fight through a winter and which ones collapsed. It built trade routes across deserts, funded the construction of palaces and cathedrals, and provided the economic foundation for empires that lasted centuries. People were imprisoned for it, killed for it, and marched hundreds of miles to reclaim their right to it. Kings hoarded it, revolutionaries fought over it, emperors built entire bureaucracies just to tax it. And now you can find it next to the pepper on a table at any diner in the world, and nobody thinks it is remarkable at all. That gap between what salt once was and what it is now tells you something important about how civilizations work. The things that feel permanent and inevitable, the power structures, the hierarchies, the economic systems, they are often built on foundations that can shift overnight. Rome felt permanent. The British Empire felt permanent. The idea that salt would always be precious felt permanent. None of it was. You can see this pattern repeating across history with other resources too. Oil dominates our world today, the same way salt dominated the ancient and medieval world. Entire economies depend on it. Wars are fought over it. Governments rise and fall based on who controls the supply. But technology is already changing the equation. Just like industrial mining and evaporation changed it for salt, one day, probably sooner than most people expect, oil might follow the same path. From the most strategic substance on the planet to a commodity so cheap and abundant that no one gives it a second thought. Salt did not stop mattering because it became less useful. Your body needs it just as much as a Roman soldier's body did 2,000 years ago. What changed was access. When salt was rare and hard to produce, the people who controlled it controlled everything. When technology made it abundant, that power evaporated. The mineral stayed the same. The world around it transformed completely. So the next time you reach for that shaker at dinner or step over a pile of road salt on a winter sidewalk, take a second to think about what you are looking at. You are looking at a substance that built civilizations and destroyed them. That was worth its weight in gold, and then worth almost nothing. That marched armies across continents and marched Gandhi to the sea. All of human history compressed into a tiny white crystal that dissolves on your tongue. If you found this interesting, hit that subscribe button and leave a comment telling us which part of salt's history surprised you the most. We have plenty more stories like this one coming, so make sure you do not miss them.